Can you see on your screen my PowerPoint at this point?
Yeah, yes, Professor.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are, and welcome for joining us for today's book talk at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers and hosted by Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, JIPA. I'm Indu Saxena, senior writer with the Consortium. We at Consortium are really pleased to host this event focusing on Peter Dombrowski and Simon Reich's book titled Across Type, Time, and Space, American Grand Strategy in Comparative Perspective. For today's discussion, we have Professor Simon Reich with us, and we'll be hosting a subsequent panel discussion with other authors, sometimes in late August. So please stay tuned for our next brainstorming session with our esteemed speakers. I'm also be joined by Dr. Ernest Rockwell, the director of the consortium and the editor-in-chief of Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, in this discussion with his special comments. Moving ahead, first of all, I would like to invite Dr. Rockwell to tell a bit about the consortium. Dr. Rock, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Indu. Well, I want to welcome everyone to this book discussion. As Indu mentioned, we'll be focusing on the co-authored book Across Type, Time, and Space, American Grand Strategy and Comparative Perspective. And I want to thank also Dr. Simon Reich for joining us today to share his insights into the book and American Grand Strategy writ large. Today's presentation, as mentioned, is brought to you by the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers, which is affiliated with Air University's Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs. The consortium is a volunteer think tank with members from throughout the region and from backgrounds in academia, the military, and government. And it's something that we stood up earlier this year to provide some in-house capabilities within the journal, but we're expanding out into other endeavors as well. We're working very closely with the command staffs at Indo-PACOM, Pacific Air Forces, and reaching out into the similar organizations throughout the region. Before we get going too far, I need to put the disclaimer out there. We are, since we are affiliated with the government, the views and opinions expressed or implied in this presentation are those of the participants and should not be construed as carrying the official sanction of the Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force, Air Education and Training Command, Air University, or other agencies or departments of the U.S. government or their international equivalents. I think that's all I've got for now, Indu, and I'll have some more comments, I guess, when we get towards the end. And I want to thank Indu for putting this together, and also to congratulate her on her recent promotion within the consortium to be my deputy director.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you for recognition of my effort. And I look forward to working with all team members to take this consortium at next level. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce our today's esteemed speaker, Professor Simon Reich, co-author of this volume. Simon Reich is a professor in the Division of Global Affairs and Department of Political Science at Rutgers University and Seri Sciences Po, Paris. He is author, co-author, and editor of 13 books and over 60 articles or book chapters. Professor Reich has published in several major journals, including International Affairs, International Organization, International Security, and Security Studies. He is currently working on a book on grand strategy of the European Union. His work has been translated into Chinese, Dutch, French, German, Japanese, and Turkish. Professor Reich has received numerous grants and visiting scholarships. Professor Reich previously served as Director of Research and Analysis at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, also known as Chatham House, and the inaugural director of the Ford Institute of Human Security at the University of Pittsburgh. He is the recipient of numerous awards and fellows and will spend the winter and spring of 2022 as the George Soros Visiting Distinguished Chair in Vienna, Austria. This there's a lot more to tell about Professor Reich, as this is a shortened version of his bio. May I invite Professor Reich to provide an overview of his book? Please type your questions for the QA in the chat section. I am so excited to listen and learn from our distinguished speaker. Professor Reich, the floor is yours.
Thank you, thank you. And let me begin by expressing my gratitude to not only my hosts for inviting me, but all you intrepid people who on a Friday in late July have decided that you're worth investing some time to listen to me rather than sit on a beach, be up a mountain, etc. I'm in Paris at the moment, where I'm spending the summer. I'm a Série affiliate at Sciences Po, and I come here for most summers. So I'm delighted to be able to join you. But all my friends and neighbors are on a beach or up a mountain at the moment. So I appreciate the effort. Thank you. What I want to do is spend a little time today talking to you about our new book, Across Type, Time and Space, American Grand Strategy and Comparative Perspective, which has just been published by Cambridge. They made the book freely accessible in its first 14 days, which I don't quite understand the business model behind this, but they made it freely available in PDF form, and 3,300 copies or more than that were downloaded. So we seem to have struck a chord. Let me talk to you about the basic project that we're looking at. And what I'm going to talk about today, albeit briefly, and I'll come back in question time, is 4 components, right? Conventional approaches to understanding grand strategy and their underlying assumptions. The countervailing assumptions that we use in our project, broadly defined. That's a project that includes Thierry Balzac of Sciences Po, Peter Dombrowski of the Naval War College, and myself. I'll spend a little time focusing on our framework that we utilize and how we apply it across time, type, and space. And then at the end, I want to look at some abiding questions that intrepid researchers might want to think about if they pursue their own research in this vein. This book is part of a broader project that Thierry, Peter, and myself have been pursuing for the last several years. It includes a series of articles such as Peace and Security Studies 3 years ago or so, an edited book with Oxford University Press, which included a study of 10 different countries, as well as a preliminary framework that we discussed. A book series that the 3 of us are working on, which are national studies of grand strategies in particular countries. We're obviously in the early stages of that project, but we are commissioning books, for example, on several Asian countries, Ethiopia, in Africa, several European countries, and we hope to expand that list moving forward. Indeed, we have one on the EU that's coming. The book, obviously, that I will discuss today, and a new book that Thierry Balzac and I are working on, which is a sociological approach to the study of grand strategy, which is something that's significantly missing in the literature in general. Let me spend a couple of minutes talking about conventional approaches to the study of grand strategy. Essentially, we begin by noting that there is no concurrence or convergence on a definition of grand strategy, and briefly stated, it can be divided into a classical approach, which looks at grand strategy very narrowly, and based on von Clausewitz, it's basically a conception that says grand strategy is about the fighting and winning of wars, and little more than that. Then that can be juxtaposed against a much broader definition, which is often employed by liberals and advocates of sponsorship, which we call the IR version, which has a much broader definition, which originates with Little Hart's work in the 1940s. He says it's not just about fighting and winning wars, but it's also about winning the peace. And that incorporates, that takes you off in a very different direction, not just counterterrorism, but it takes you into much broader fields that liberals often utilize. The major debate in the field as currently constructed is between liberals and realists, various different hues of realists, primacists, advocates of restraint who are very vocal in Washington at the moment, and of course, isolationists. But the field is currently dominated by by case studies of great powers, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But as currently constituted, it really narrows the empirical focus to the United States, China, and Russia, with the overwhelming preponderance of work being on the United States. That implies an emphasis on military instruments rather than diplomatic and economic ones, and largely a focus on prescription. So every 4 years, if there's a new president, or 8 years, if there's a new president, there is a whole series of efforts made to prescribe what the new administration's policies should be. The consequence of this is that there really is no framework for generalization and study. And most interestingly for us, I include at the bottom, that essentially there are no theories of grand strategy. There are only theories of grand strategy, or pardon me, there are only grand strategies that are based on other theories in international relations, balance of power theory, power transition theory. But there really is nothing on the question of why countries choose particular types of grand strategies, or for example, the distinction between domestic and systemic factors in explaining it. So this leads to a series of assumptions, and for the purposes of time, I'll be very brief, right? So that basically grand strategy is seen as rational calculations and all of the implications that that implies, that the focus is rather more on systemic, external threats, and to a limited extent, strategic opportunities, rather than focusing on the nature of domestic politics. Not surprisingly, kinetic threats, violence and conflict dominate over other kinds of threats, such as what we call anthropogenic, which is climate change, or naturogenic, such as pandemics. And it's assumed that you need a large bureaucracy and a powerful military to create and to implement forms of grand strategy. The external environment is conceived of as relatively stable and knowable. And this becomes very important when you look at and you conceive of the notion of a grand strategy as architecture, as a blueprint, because it assumes that the world is relatively knowable and unchanging, right? It's marked by continuity rather than change. And that the purpose of a grand strategy, being the province only of great powers, is to control or shape, and I'll come back to the distinction later if you want, the external environment, not to adapt to that external environment. This implies that policymakers may want to know something about smaller states, and smaller states by definition is anybody else except great powers. But the assumption is that those smaller states, because they don't have these large bureaucracies and militaries, the assumption is that they cannot have a grand strategy. And I just think of Iran as a counterexample, because, or North Korea as a counterexample, because these countries have obviously, the empirical evidence suggests, pursued grand strategies for the last 10, 20, 30 years. And it may explain in part why American policymakers have such a difficult time dealing with them if you don't recognize it. Our work implies a contrasting set of assumptions, right? That you can compare, that small states, and indeed a variety of other actors, cities, states, etc., can have a grand strategy. That the purpose of studying these grand strategies can be both theoretical for scholars, but also diagnostic, rather than working on prescriptions of what countries should or should not do. That obviously our conception of grand strategy incorporates this notion of adaptation, that most states do adapt, but interestingly enough, we believe that some states can do very well at shaping their regional environment, even if they can't control it. And again, I gave a couple of examples here I can return to of North Korea and Northeast Asia and Israel in the Middle East being very powerful in terms of shaping the politics of their regions. The substance, therefore, can expand beyond, we assume, kinetic conflict into dealing with issues like anthropogenic and naturogenic threats. And they're all the substance of grand strategy. How states deal with pandemics is a good example of that. And thus, we look beyond military instruments. We look at, for example, how markets work in the case of Saudi Arabia as the leading power in OPEC, how Austria, as an example, was able to provide a grand strategy as a bridge between the East and West during the Cold War, or indeed how the Qataris were able to use trade, aid, and investment to defeat the boycott that was that the Gulf Cooperation Council states attempted to impose upon them. So this implies that grand strategy involves a plethora of instruments, and that these can apply as much to public health or to battling climate change as they can to conventional and nuclear conflict. Most pointedly, we believe and we assume that elites reflect or interpret historical factors to define the goals, prioritize threats, develop and marshal resources. That rational actor models are not necessarily a segue into understanding grand strategy in a way that realism or liberalism assumes. And that finally, that domestic politics are not simply systemic threats or opportunities play a significant role. I noted at the bottom our 2019 edited book, Comparative Grand Strategy. The introductory chapter is freely available on the internet, so you can have a look at that if you're interested. Download it. I know it's on ResearchGate because I put it there if you're interested. So what is our framework? Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to point out that we begin, rather than making this series of assertions, we ask a series of questions about any particular state, right? So think of one that you're interested, right? So what definition of grand strategy does it adopt in practice, empirically? Does it use a classical definition? Say, for example, North Korea might fit that. Or does it use a much broader IR definition in which we look at diplomatic and economic instruments as well as military ones? What kind of threats do states tend to prioritize? Are they anthropogenic or naturogenic as opposed to kinetic? What kind of objective historical factors, but also subjective collective memories influence the way that states think about, perceive their threats and opportunities? I was very interested to read a recent book in which Henry Kissinger is interviewed by Winston Lord, in which he referred to national pathologies. When he looked at particular statesmen that he was negotiating with in his long career, he would always characterize their behavior in terms of the national pathologies, which is a way of saying subjective factors, perception, collective memory. What are their national concerns that influence the way they think about the world in determining their choices, and thus what in military academies we call the ends of grand strategy. And thus, to what extent do objective versus subjective factors play in the process, and how are these played out in terms of a domestic audience, whether you think of bureaucratic politics as a factor, or factional infighting, which may best describe events in Iran, or interpolitical party disputes and changing political leadership, which may best describe the United States at this point. And thus ultimately the question we ask is, what are the ways and means, the instruments and resources that states choose to use, and why? And the most telling example of that, of course, is the development of nuclear weapons programs, why they choose to do so. But of course, the resources that are commonly thought about, traditional resources by realists, are natural resources, the size of the economy or a population, the size of a military or political capacity. But these are not the only resources that states tend to use. And again, I can go into further examples. So table 1, that I won't go through here, but table 1 from our book attempts to provide a systematic way of looking at these. And you can think of this as a mix and match. Think about a particular country that you might be studying, researching, and think about what are the series of choices that it makes from this menu of possibilities of assumptions, ends, ways. So in that context, in the book, we try and illustrate the ways in which the United States could be thought about. So much work is done on the United States, and of course it's the one about which we're best informed. So we attempted to look at type, time, and space in the context of the United States. Table 2 here is simply, I don't have time to go over it, but we identify 5 different kinds of grand strategy that are predominantly, is that since Posen and Ross's 1996 article, that's a generation ago, there has not been a major article on comparing different kinds of grand strategies. And so the section of the book that's devoted to this goes into some detail and culminates in this particular table, which tries to systematically answer the questions that I just raised as part of our research. There are 3 or 4 key things that arise from looking at this, that even though this is one that provisionally is about the United States, but let me generalize a little bit, right? What's notable about that table is that each different formulation may have common characteristics, but what you emerge with is a unique formulation that can be applied. So different realist formulations share zero-sum assumptions, but then they go off in very different directions. And those are not necessarily always transparent in debates in the journals. So we found a useful exercise for distinguishing. Some approaches are unique, certainly, to great powers on a global scale, such as primacy. But, and this comes back to smaller states and their influence, smaller states can pursue variants of these different approaches, albeit either locally or regionally. So Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, for example, are persistently fighting it out to be hegemonic within the context of the Middle East. And so even though you can't apply primacy to their goals globally, it's still worthwhile thinking about whether these different models can be applied at a local or regional level. Most states, of course, tend to employ adaptive grand strategies such as sponsorship or even forms of isolationism in their approaches, but looking to see whether one state fits one approach is not going to be very useful in practice. What we discovered was the way in which you really want to think about it is how these different approaches configure with each other. And the final general point we got from out of looking at this was that, of course, these approaches can be applied by a variety of states, great and small, supposedly middle powers such as Japan, even city-states such as Singapore, which I find to be a fascinating case of a city-state that has employed a very effective grand strategy, and even, of course, non-state actors. The question you have to ask yourself is, how do they configure the diplomatic, economic, and military instruments, the three domains of grand strategy, and how do they balance them? How do they deploy them? And in our research, what we discover is different states that, even states that look markedly similar in terms of the international system, balance these three elements in very different ways. So, looking at the three elements that we discuss in the book, right? The first thing we look at is studying across time. Historians tend to, of course, study strategies across time, but they don't tend to use formal frameworks that allow, so you have great historians like Gaddis or Kennedy, right? Who write fascinating work, but they don't use a systematic framework that aids the social scientist in terms of comparison. Of course, if you study one country over time, it has the benefit of many factors remaining constant, because this allows you to then focus on, well, what are the key differences? The threats may change, but what you also discover, of course, is that the politics can change. And it's quite often domestic politics that changes in terms of the definition of the threats, and thus the ends, ways, and means that follow. In that context, in the book, we took the example of the US, Europe, and Russia. Traditionally, one of the great domains, using 9/11 as a critical juncture for our research, we looked at how American strategy towards Russia had changed through the Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden administrations. And there were no, although obviously there are systemic changes in terms of the Russian behavior and American responses to that behavior, the fundamentals cannot be simply explained by systemic factors, but we look far more at the notion of domestic leadership and how that influence and perceptions. Trump's behavior, for example, makes no sense in the context of systemic threats, because the systemic threats were growing, and instead of responding with deterrence, he preferred to respond with what I can best describe as supplication to Russia. In terms of traditional realist approaches, for example, this makes no sense. But we could say the same thing about looking at the shift in American behavior in the Indo-Pacific itself towards China. Obviously, again, we could focus on aggressive Chinese behavior, and we can return to that in discussion, and new wolf diplomacy, et cetera, but at the same time, even that cannot explain completely explain the tilt that American approach has taken in terms of, say, a decoupling strategy that the United States is now discussing. Let's look at across space. The general assumption of the United States is, the general discussion in the United States is that grand strategies are either about controlling or shaping. But in practice, what we argue in this section is that, in fact, they aren't simply architectures that are then implemented wholesale. Rather, they are, and this is key, that they are relational and adaptive. And thus, what's really interesting is the assumption that great powers shape or control is somewhat of a misnomer. What tends to happen is that there is an interactive process in which the United States is responding as much as it is attempting to shape or dominate. So primacy, liberal deep engagement, etc., assumes control. Assumes control. Restraint assumes shaping. But in fact, when we look in this section of the book at the Indo-Pacific, what we discover is that the United States is largely responding to changes initiated in the last 10 years by China. And so if we start off by thinking about the command structure, the movement, the shift from the definition of the region, Asia, to the Indo-Pacific, it is in response to changes that have taken place largely since 2011. States may move interactively between trying to control, trying to shape, and trying to adapt, but the onus is on the researcher to not assume one of these three, but to investigate which of these are taking place, in which domains, at which points in time, and to try and explain those shifts, which is something that the study of grand strategy largely fails to do. So for those of you out there who may be thinking about your doctoral dissertation and working on the Indo-Pacific, for example, right? The questions become, well, when are the Chinese, as an example, when are the Chinese trying to control? When are the Chinese trying to shape? When are the Chinese trying to adapt? And as a secondary question, that's an analytic question. The secondary theoretical question was, what explains these three different patterns? Because at the moment we live in a world where scholars seem to assume one of those three, and policymakers who are being advised by scholars, or the work of scholars in general, whether they're reading something, you know, that they've read, or whether these are scholars working in the administration, they take those assumptions to heart. Our case studies, interestingly, in the book, our case studies suggest that even the US is busy responding or adapting more to China than it is shaping or controlling in the Indo-Pacific. Whether we're discussing FONOPs, freedom of navigation operations, the reconstitution of the command structure, seeking to restore its alliances with NATO partners and the Quad. I mean, there's a whole list of factors I could look at there in which the United States is largely adapting in the region rather than anything else. So we conclude that in the last decade, the US has been pursued an adaptive grand strategy, which is really inconsistent with the first assumptions we talked about regarding great powers. The United States is still the strongest power on earth, and yet here it adapts rather than shapes or controls. And I think that there's a broader lesson there for other examples, other regions, other countries. So my time is brief, but I just want to mention a few questions that you need to ask yourself if you're looking at any particular state, right? So what definition do they use? How do they combine controlling, shaping, and adapting? Do they tend to focus on the local? And by the local, I mean just the immediate contiguous neighborhood. Do they tend to focus on the region? Do they tend to focus on the global? And I use the example of Britain there as Britain tries to rebalance itself away from a regional strategy, largely involving the EU, to now this post-Brexit global Britain strategy, which they've been very explicit about. And I was reading elements about it the other day in government reports. It's quite interesting. Do they employ one type of grand strategy? Do they use a hybrid of elements of two or more? And most presidents, I can come back to this, but American presidents constantly are using hybrids, right? So Trump tried to use elements of primacy combined with elements of isolationism. Obama tended to use elements of restraint and elements of sponsorship. But I think it gives us a much better, keener sense of what these presidents are trying to do than simply calling what they're doing a doctrine, giving it a couple of characteristics as a doctrine. I was reading the first piece the other day about the Biden doctrine by Hal Brands, and it's fascinating, but I think that it lacks the capacity for generalizability that you might get if you think about it in more formal terms. What is the role of historical factors and or shifting domestic factors? And this is important because it helps us formulate theories of grand strategy, why particular grand strategies are pursued at particular periods of time. And thus, it also leads us into thinking about who are the actors. That is, they're not simply always states. They can, elements of grand strategies can involve non-state actors, corporations, proxies, such as the Iranian use of proxies, or even transnational criminal networks, if we think about Russia and cyber, okay? So the implementation of a grand strategy, you've got to ask the empirical question. You can't make the assumption that it is states. And lastly, of course, this requires us to look at the means, and that entails, say, looking at the different domains, the diplomatic, the economic, the military, in thinking about how a state combines elements of each in unique or comparable ways. So, given the time that I have, I conclude at this point, and I shall stop my screen share, but I'm very happy to entertain questions. I know that I've covered a lot very quickly, so I apologize for my superficiality. But I have lots of examples that I'm very happy to share with you. And so if you have any comments or questions, I welcome it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful and detailed presentation. The book is a fantastic read and is of immense interest to students, scholars, and researchers. Let's try to dig it more out with the question and answers. Professor, my first question is that how do you see similarities and difference in the US grand strategy towards China from Nixon to Biden?
How long do we have? So I'm going to give you a brief response, but I think it's telling, right? So, I mean, there's obviously been a fundamental change. And to many of you who are have far more expertise than I do, you can identify that far better than I, right? So the great American bet of the second half of the 20th century in what was then defined as Asia was that engagement with China would lead to a liberal capitalist formulation. And so starting with Nixon, of course, the idea was to very much to split China from Russia, which was then our greatest threat, and to incorporate China into a working coalition, if not a formal one, with the United States, and that would undermine the Soviet threat. The second stage then became, under Clinton, in the aftermath of the Cold War, really became engagement for this capitalist liberal democratic venture. Now, starting with Trump and continuing under Biden, the system has been very much one in which they are defined as strategic rivals and competitors. This is a language that's been adopted not just by the United States, but also by the Europeans. And so I can say that we've really go through three emphatic stages that are quite discernible. Where that leaves us in terms of the future, I don't know. Wendy Sherman was just, as they described in the newspaper, as being snubbed for a visit with high-ranking officials with China, and the Chinese just appointed an ambassador to Washington who has a history of very aggressive comments about the United States. So this does, neither of these events augur well, but we can only hope that they're temporary and they're not definitive in taking us off in a pattern.
Thank you, Professor. I know that the question had just covered a half a century from 1970 to 2021, but you gave the answer so briefly. I appreciate that. Now, my next, I move forward to my next question. From the Munich Security Conference to G7 to the NATO summit, President Biden's every speech on foreign policy has called for rallying of allies and partners with unmatched enduring advantage. How do you analyze China in Biden's grand strategy when we have seen the 3 top official visit to Asia, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman to China, Defense Secretary Austin to Singapore, Vietnam, and Philippines, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken to India in this week? Is China an imaginary enemy of US?
Well, the last sentence is very different from everything that preceded it, right? So, okay. So, what's notable about Biden's behavior so far in terms of China is one, continuing to define China as a strategic adversary. The word adversary is not used, the word rival is used, but continuing to define it as such. And yet, at the same time, taking a discernibly different strategic approach in terms of a reliance on multilateralism. I'm not convinced that this strategy is going to work. My concerns are that the multilateralism is built on a notion of containment. And this notion of containment really echoes the kind of strategic approach the United States used towards the Soviet Union in the Cold War. But the circumstances are so fundamentally different. China is so well integrated into the global economy that even America's closest allies are not going to, they will support the United States in the security domain, but they will not support the United States in other domains. Diplomatically, perhaps, economically, that's far more problematic. And so, the strategy is going to require nuance. Washington is not great with nuance. Washington is great with, show me an enemy, I can deal with that enemy, right? In a very sort of one-dimensional sense. It's going to be deeply problematic, and it's going to take some recognition of the fact that we are not going to replay, I've heard references to Cold War II. We are not going to have a bipolar system. We're going to have a bifurcated system, and I can talk about the distinction between the two. But we're not going to have a bipolar system. It's going to be a lot more complex, requiring a lot more sophistication. And it's not that people are unsophisticated, but Washington does tend to work on bumper stickers. And even for the best analysts in the world, trying to get that through to policymakers in a way that they can act upon it. The Strategic Competition Act of 2021 is an interesting piece. But it's long on rhetoric and short on action. Well, okay, I'll cut off there. The perception, well, we go through periods in the United States, and I've lived in the United States long enough to have witnessed this firsthand. We go through periods of great triumphalism. We are the best. Everything is wonderful. Think of Fukuyama's book in the early 2000s, The End of History and the Last Man. We have won. And that's usually followed by periods of declinism. The bottom is going to fall out. And you know, we're really at a crucial point at the moment, because when we go into periods of declinism, the temptation is to find an enemy to rally ourselves around. I'm old enough to remember when everything they say about China today, they were saying about Japan in the 1980s. Japan was about to become the biggest economy in the world. I remember books with titles like The Coming War with Japan. Obviously, things don't play out that way. So it'll be interesting to see how the Chinese are doing their very best at the moment to create this notion in the United States of an enemy. You know, when the wolf diplomacy, the guy that they've just decided to send to Washington, the snubbing of those American officials. The Americans may be making plentiful mistakes at the moment, but there's more than enough blame to go around, and the Chinese have their fair share.
I'm taking this question, and then I will invite Dr. Rockwell for his comments, additional comments, and then we will go to our QA session. I have a few questions if time allows, and then I will get back to my questions. Statistics shows that despite all the decoupling rhetoric, US-China trade is booming. The bilateral trade between two countries surged in 2021 with China export to US $46.9 billion and imports from the United States is $14.3 billion in June. Mm-hmm. What do you say about this puzzle? What is the alternative of China's economic prowess?
So what the puzzle is, are we going to decouple? How can we talk about decoupling in the current context? And this comes back to my prior point, right? That decoupling, I think that there will be efforts at decoupling, right? So all that discussion about the domestic versus global supply chains and about the resuscitation of American industry for the middle class are examples of deeply problematic examples of ways in which we're going to return to some notion, or to continue some notion, of isolationism that was instituted by Trump. There's a difference in rhetoric between America first and, domestic supply chains, but the reality is that they're not that far apart. So there will be efforts at decoupling. I personally, and this is the book that I'm now working on, which is not on the EU's grand strategy so much, but EU strategies for dealing between the conundrum of dealing with the Chinese and the Americans simultaneously. I think that what you will see, and this is the thesis of our book, that you will see areas in which Europeans, as America's major ally, will side with the United States. And the most obvious area is the one we're focusing on much today, which is national security. But there are other domains, such as trade and investment, where they're far more likely to hedge towards the Chinese rather than the Americans, because of those deeply embedded trade relationships that you were referring to before, Indu. So I foresee that in this complexity will be referenced before will be playing itself out.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for
I do want to answer, if I may. I saw one question in the chat from my dearly beloved friend Marianne Perron-Douze, and I don't know whether she's still on the line, but I do want to answer her question, if I may, because, I think it's a very important question.
Sure,
and for those of you who are not seeing it on the chat, it's basically about who can have a grand strategy. And I want to answer that by saying, we are far from asserting that every country can have a grand strategy, right? So there's a whole series of failed states where this is inconceivable. There's a whole series of states, take an example like Belarus, who are really, subservient to the Russians, where any notion of a grand strategy is, of course, inconceivable, because grand strategy implies a certain degree of autonomous thinking, and they're just puppet regimes. But to answer the question, instead of assuming that only great powers can have a grand strategy, let's turn it around and make it a question and say, okay, let's look at a particular country and see whether this country is capable of having one. What is the evidence that it has one? So to start out with a question rather than an assumption. And I found that doing that leads you down very interesting paths, right? So for example, Norway, I find Norway to be an interesting case, right? And I can explain all kinds of reasons why, but they combine military, diplomatic, and economic elements. They have oil. They are one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. They have a series of values that they call the Norwegian backpack. Nobody would think about studying Norwegian grand strategy, but I drive my colleagues Thierry and Peter crazy talking about cases like Norway or Rwanda or Qatar, and of course we all agree on Singapore, right? So so the question. So I don't begin with the assumption anybody can. I begin with the question. Well, what are the key elements here? So she mentioned Seychelles as a promoter of the blue economy. We really have reached the end of my knowledge basis when we reach Seychelles. I have no response to that. Sorry, Indu, I just wanted to respond to that very interesting question.
Sure, Professor. Thank you. Now I would like to invite Dr. Ernest Rockwell for his perspective and additional comments. Dr. Rockwell.
I don't know that I'm going to provide any additional perspective on it or anything, but I did have a few questions. First of all, fantastic presentation. I did want to ask one question. So it seems that your approach kind of mirrors the DIME construct that we use in the military quite frequently, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. But I didn't see the informational domain there. Was that intentional? And if so, why? And then my second question would be, what was the second question? Well,
let me try and answer. Let me try and answer that one, and then maybe the second one will come back. Is that reasonable?
Sure.
Okay. So yeah, and if you have a look at the book, you'll see that there's plenty of reference to DIME. I did mention soft power, but in a more formal sense, and this comes back to that table 1 that I just flitted through briefly because of time, but. So if you think of diplomacy, you can think of diplomacy in like all 3 domains, diplomatic, economic, and political. You can think of variants within them, right? So you can, in the context of diplomacy, you can think of formal diplomacy, right? Negotiation, bargaining in the State Department. You can also think of informal modes of diplomacy, such as the way in which markets operate, the way in which sending messages of consumerism, the kind of thing that Joe Nye has talked about extensively. You can talk about formal elements of information, therefore, through the State Department. You can think of informal elements, even through things like NGOs being busy promoting human rights, rule of law, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, we absolutely do engage with the notion of DIME. We just do it in a different kind of a way. Sorry, your second question.
The second question was, you mentioned that you had made a distinction between a bipolar world and a bifurcated world. And yes, I did kind of want to have you play that out a little bit for us.
Oh, lovely. I'm so glad you asked, genuinely. Okay, so when we thought of, and one of our colleagues online asked the same question, so I hope he's able to listen to my answers. So I'm working on a project with Richard Higgett, and if you happen to be interested, we published a paper in the LSE's web page. It's called Ideas, so LSE Ideas, and we published a piece there which gives you some sense of this for for those who want to pursue it. So essentially a bipolar world, and again, I'm old enough to remember it, right, was completely bifurcated. It was completely distinct or bifurcated in the sense that they were impermeable borders. And I mean that economically, as well as politically, as well as physically. I'm old enough to remember taking a train through the old West Germany and going to Berlin on a train, and the train being stopped in the middle of a field, and East German border guards getting on this train in the middle of the field and going through the train very systematically to make sure that nobody had jumped on the train and was trying to escape. That's a bipolar world, insulated borders. A bifurcated world has porous borders. And by porous borders, the best way I can illustrate is coming back to my discussion about Europeans, where Europeans might support the United States in one area, but then support China in another, or even take an independent third position. The United States, when it talks about decoupling, really wants an economic, diplomatic, and security decoupling to the best degree that's feasible from China. To isolate China, and that's simply not going to work. What we see is states, allies, moving back and forth between the United States and China on a relatively routine basis nowadays. So if you think of the Belt and Road Initiative as an example and who signed up to be involved in this, the United States implored its close allies from Japan to South Korea, Australia, the British, or other Europeans, right, not to be involved in this. And most of them ended up, the overwhelming majority ended up signing up and becoming involved in this in one form or another. So the critical distinction between the two is how porous those worlds are. If we think of decoupling, again, if we think of decoupling in a strict bipolar sense, then that is a strategy doomed to failure. That bounded world that divided the Soviet Union and the West will not be repeated. And this is why Cold War II is a misleading, pardon me, is a misleading concept. It won't get us there.
Thank you for that. I'm going to, it looks like we're almost out of time, but if the professor has a few more moments, we do have we do have quite a few questions over in the question panel and the chat panel. So Indu, I'm going to hand it back to you. Yeah. And I cede the rest of my time to people with inquiries on their mind.
Sure, Doc. Thanks, Professor. Like, we have a numerous question in our chat, and I have my questions too. I guess we will be hosting you very soon again. And I am just reading from the chat. Please, pardon me. I don't know which question was the first and now. And I am taking the question here from Arushi, that's a consortium member. Debates and deliberates around grand strategy are linked to hegemony and hierarchy, which further are informed by cultural and social practices, especially American exceptionalism and China's Tianjia. As such, how have these self-perception affected the grand strategy of these countries?
Okay. So what we talk about a little bit in this work and talk about much more, I mean, in this book, and talk about much more expansively elsewhere, is the notion that states are really, in a sense, heavily influenced by their collective memories. And I don't have the list in front of me, but I have, because I'm going to forget one, but I talk about 4 classifications of collective memories that states think about, right? One of them is exceptionalism. One of them is restoration. This glorious, we had a glorious empire and we wish to restore it. And that's symptomatic, for example, Erdogan's discussion of Turkey. You know, he's very explicit about wanting to restore that empire. Lots of states think about themselves in terms of victimhood. The politics of the Balkans in the aftermath of the Balkan Wars is quite fascinating because, you know, the Kosovo, Croatia, they still worry about the Serbian threat, even as they become, you know, aligned with NATO and they become aligned with the European Union, and so even some of the Balkan states that have had access now to the European Union, they still worry about the Serbians coming over the border. So in that context, you know, the Chinese, the question, the Chinese, for example, Xi's notion is clearly restorative of the Middle Kingdom, right? That China should be by rights the dominant power in Asia. The 9-dash line is an expression of that notion, which bears no relationship to contemporary geopolitical realities. And so one of the things that we seek to study, and in the edited book that I mentioned, we had 10 pieces. I saw Gaida Hetu was at least here earlier. Gaida wrote a fascinating piece on Saudi Arabia, chapter on Saudi Arabia and how the Saudis think about their role in the world. Thierry Balzac co-authored a piece with Wendy Ramadan about how the Iranians think about their role in the world. And in this context, yes, American exceptionalism has historically played an important role. What I find quite fascinating about the current state of the debate, quite unlike previous periods in American history, is that Trump basically asserted that the United States was now a normal power. Okay, President Trump, even in his his inaugural address, said, well, I wish to restore the United States, right? Make America great again. But at the moment, we pursue our nominal interest just like you. And so American exceptionalism was really understated in his speech and in much of his presidency. Paradoxically, he shares that in common with American progressives nowadays, because American progressives consistently don't point to American exceptionalism, except in terms of talking about slavery as being the great stain upon American history, and that, you know, the United States is a model for nowhere until it gets its own house in order, and that is not a simple thing to do. So whether we're looking at positions from the right or positions from the left, this notion of American exceptionalism, which has really dominated American thinking from the formation of the Republic until certainly into the 21st century, has now become a problematic component. The interesting question for us going forward is, to what extent will this reconception of the United States on the right and the left play out in terms of the way it thinks about its grand strategy and its foreign policies as a result? And there's a great discussion taking place at the moment in the United States about a foreign policy for the middle class. I don't know whether any of you have come across the work, but the Carnegie Corporation issued a major report, etc. And this is a really an attempt to recast the way in which Americans should think about their strategy and their policy. And it'll be fascinating to see how this plays out in the future. I can't predict where it will go, whether these things are a fad as part of a cycle, or whether they're going to make a permanent structural change on the way we think about these things.
Thank you, Professor. Doc, do we have more time so we can take more questions?
As long as the professor has time, I've got time. So
sure. I have a few more minutes I can gladly share with you. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
So we have one more question from Wei Ming. Under the background that China's space capability has been greatly enhanced and even has a space station, What is the probability of success of the US Indo-Pacific strategy to contain China's development?
Well, the question, I don't know whether it's advertent or inadvertent, links to quite distinct elements, right? The one is the United States interested in containing China's development? Is sort of unrelated to the space station, okay, which is a separate. They're both very good questions. Now, I'm not sure, what we tried to do, coming back to my earlier comment, what we tried to do was shape China's development into a mirror image of our conception of a Western nation, right? The question is, have we abandoned that or not? Are we still trying to shape, or are we trying to contain? And I think that there are elements in Washington that would say yes to both of those, right? There are people who think that, well, they're accommodating, they're trying to moderate the situation, and they're saying, well, we want China in what is now sounds like antiquated language to be a responsible stakeholder in the international community. And so there is no effort there on their part to truncate or to thwart China's development, but to try and shape it, yes. Then obviously there are the people who don't want to be accommodationists at this point, who see this as a strategic, existential strategic conflict. And my worry is that they are going to become the dominant voices in Washington. Because we, the United States, are incapable of thwarting China's development. That ship has sailed a long time ago. And so in that context, efforts to do that, I think, are only just going to lead to frustration and anger. The question is, how can we shape, for example, to what extent can we influence the way the Chinese think about climate change? One of the other questions referred to climate change, I think, from Ali Tekin, my beloved former student in Turkey. The United States cannot coerce, cajole, bribe the Chinese into changing their climate change policy. But what they can possibly do is negotiate. And in that context, the capacity for negotiation is going to play a major role in space. The Chinese have obviously demonstrated a significant and highly impressive space capability in the context of the last 5 to 10 years. The development has been tremendous. But like the Americans, they are going to run into, before them, and the Russians before them, they're going to run into all kinds of issues, whether they're technical issues or financial issues. I see this, the Russians sent up a module to the space station this week, and that it misfired at one point in the last 2 days, pushing the space station off course. It was supposed to be launched in 2007. It was launched in 2021. I mean, there's a series of issues that you run into in terms of space capability, and as impressive as Chinese development has been, they're going to run up against those sooner or later. And that may be the point at which collaboration returns rather than competition in space.
Thanks, Professor. Do we have more time?
Last question.
I don't think so that we have more time. I'm just wrapping up the session. Thank you, thank you, Professor Reich. Thank you, Dr. Rockwell. Attendees, thank you very much. At this point, I would also like to offer thanks to our operation team who helped us in making this event happen and join with us. So thank you, Professor Reich, for this wonderful book talk. And we will be hosting in late August the brainstorming session with other authors and other experts of this American Grand Strategy and Indo-Pacific. Stay tuned for our next webinar in late August. I will keep posting. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome, Professor.
Thank you for a great presentation.
Bye.